Tocqueville on Democratic Individualism, Lecture 2. In the last lecture, I gave you an overview of Tocqueville's project, his belief that democracy will spread to Western Europe, but also his belief that democracy contained within itself some potential to go very badly. And therefore, he's writing Democracy in America and investigating America in order to try to help guide Western Europe in a favorable democratic direction. And I also spent some time talking about the characteristics of aristocratic society, since Tocqueville is constantly comparing democratic with aristocratic society, or to put it in a very brief way, aristocratic society, which is what Europe had been for hundreds and hundreds of years prior to his time, aristocratic society is marked by inequality. Inequality of wealth, inequality of rights, inequality of power, all based on birth. Whereas democratic society is marked in the most basic sense by equality, not necessarily equality in wealth, but equality of status, equality of rights, equality of opportunities. So he's constantly contrasting these things. In this lecture, we finally get to individualism, which is this particular feature of democratic society, which Tocqueville thinks is inherent in democratic society, but also very dangerous and thus needs to be combated. Now, basically what Tocqueville argues in this chapter, and this chapter is chapter 2 of part 2 of volume 2, which in your book starts on page 204. Tocqueville is arguing in this chapter that democratic equality tends to isolate people from one another. Not in the sense of just complete individuals that have nothing to do with one another, but more like in the sense that people kind of form their own kind of little bubbles of their friends and families, that people tend to concentrate most of their concern on their jobs and on their friends and their families and their personal hobbies, and people begin to grow apathetic towards the broader common good, such that people become less interested in fulfilling their broader social obligations, getting involved in local government, or getting involved in any kind of cause or organization outside of their own particular private lives and private concerns. So individualism for Tocqueville, he doesn't mean individualism in the sense of self-reliance or something like that, or wanting to be me, wanting to realize my own particular identity or things like that, but rather by individualism, he means something slightly different, or rather quite different. And he's one of the first people to use this term. So he uses individualism to refer to this tendency towards social isolation rather than self-reliance. So Tocqueville begins the chapter by actually contrasting individualism with egoism or selfishness in order to show what makes it different from that, and in order to explain why it is that individualism is so particular to democratic societies. So what he says is this is near the bottom of page 204. Individualism is a recent expression that a new idea has brought into being. Our fathers only knew about egoism. Now, egoism that's a translation of a French word that could also just mean selfishness. Egoism is a passionate and exaggerated love of oneself, which leads man to relate everything only to himself alone and to prefer himself over all things, right? And that's what we mean by selfishness. The selfish person is the person who only really cares about himself or herself and only cares about other things in relation to their own ideas and interests. So that's individualism, that's egoism. Whereas individualism, as he says at the top of page 205, is something quite different. Individualism is a reflective and peaceful sentiment that disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellow men and to draw himself off to the side with his family and his friends in such a way that after having thus created for himself a small society for his own use, he willingly abandons the larger society to itself. End of quotation. So that's at the top of page 205. That's really the definition of individualism. So you notice individualism isn't the same thing as selfishness. It's not only caring about yourself. In fact, it involves caring for other people. The point of individualism is this notion of social isolation, this way that you only really care about your friends and family. And so your whole life ends up revolving simply around your private life. You just sort of, you care about your friends and your family. That becomes, to use a term from UD, that becomes the little bubble that you live in. And you don't really care that much about the broader society, right? As he says, you create a small society for your own use, and you willingly abandon the larger society to itself. You're just kind of apathetic. I don't really know what's going on in the news. I don't really know what's going on, kind of outside of my area. I don't really care. That's somebody else's issue. I'm going to focus on, the people that I care about, that are closest to me, and my own private pursuits. And that's individualism. Now, as he's going to go on to say, that individualism like that isn't really possible outside of democratic society. But I want to mention a few other contrasts that he makes between egoism and individualism so that you understand the difference. So as he goes on to say next, egoism is born from a blind instinct. Individualism proceeds from an erroneous judgment rather than a depraved sentiment. So the basic idea there is that selfishness is just part of human nature. It says a blind instinct. We just have a kind of tendency to care primarily about ourselves. Whereas individualism, this tendency towards kind of narrowing your concern to a small circle of people in your daily life. So he says that proceeds from an erroneous judgment. And although he doesn't say what that erroneous judgment is, I think what he means by that is the erroneous judgment that you can be a more or less a self-sufficient individual and that you don't need to care about the broader society, that the broader society will take care of itself. All you need to care about is yourself and your own. I think that's the erroneous judgment. As he goes on to say in page 205, egoism dries up the germ or seed of all the virtues. Individualism at first only dries up the source of the public virtues, but over the long term, it attacks and destroys all the others and eventually becomes absorbed in egoism. So obviously, you can see how selfishness, so he says it dries up the seeds of all the virtues, right? A selfish person will probably not be courageous. A selfish person will probably not be moderate. A selfish person will probably not be just, and so on, right? So there's a way in which kind of selfishness is really sort of opposed to virtue as such. Whereas, as he says, individualism in the first place is really only opposed to the public virtues, to the virtues that make you want to stand up and serve the broader community, things like patriotism and all of that kind of stuff. So individualism, at least at first, he thinks is compatible with things like justice and moderation and all that kind of stuff. It just narrows its scope. But over time, he thinks that people who are individualistic will eventually sink into vice, and we'll get into that later. So as he then kind of concludes this, he says, egoism is a vice as old as the world. It scarcely belongs more to one form of society than to another, right? Wherever there are human beings, you find selfishness. Individualism is in origin democratic, and it risks growing as conditions become more equal. Right, so that's where he points out that individualism is particular to democracies. Now, why? Well, in the first place, you can see it by contrast, which is if individualism is sort of withdrawing from the broader society in order to focus your attention on the people that you most care about, individualism is impossible in an aristocratic society. Remember, an aristocratic society is marked by a fixed social hierarchy where everybody's kind of tied to one another through various obligations and duties and rights. So, you can especially see this in the case of the peasant, right? A peasant does not have the luxury to withdraw into a bubble where he only cares about his friends and his family, right? Because when you're a peasant, that means you have all sorts of duties. There are things you have to do to fulfill your obligations to the feudal lord or aristocrat or whoever it is that owns the land that you live on. So you've got lots of duties and you can't just shirk them, right? But in the same way, if you're an aristocratic, lord, if you're one of the people who's on the top of the social hierarchy, you have all sorts of responsibilities too in terms of governing your domain and the people that are under you, right? So people can't just tune out. They are constantly being brought outside of themselves, constantly being called upon to fulfill obligations and duties that mark the station within society that they find themselves in. So you cannot withdraw into private life. You cannot pick and choose who you spend time with, what obligations you have. Your place and thus your duties and most aspects of your life are dictated to you in an aristocratic society. And that's just the way it is. So individualism can't exist that way. Um, whereas, and I'm skipping some aspects of individualism, but whereas in a democratic society where people have individual rights, where there is social mobility, social opportunity, where there aren't these fixed hierarchies, where people don't stay always where they're born, but are free to move around, to choose professions, to change professions, to change where they live, right? To change their religion, to change all sorts of things about themselves. There's so much more mobility and opportunity in democracy because of the existence of things like equal rights and rule of law, that people do have much more of an opportunity to withdraw into their own particular and private concerns, because they don't live within that dense web of pre-established duties that constantly call them outside of themselves. Right. So let me read to you a little bit about this so you can see the contrast. As he says, this is page 205 near the middle. Among aristocratic peoples, families remain in the same state for centuries and often in the same place. That makes all generations, so to speak, contemporaries. A man almost always knows his ancestors and honors them. He believes he already sees his great-grandchildren, and he loves them. He willingly sets himself duties toward both of them, and he frequently comes to sacrifice his personal pleasures to these beings who no longer exist or who do not yet exist. Right? So in other words, there's a strong sense of continuity over time in an aristocracy because people live the same sort of life, right? You can imagine if you're some lord, my great grandfather lived in this same house. There's his picture on the wall. And I want to make sure that in everything I do that I maintain his honor, the honor of this family. And in the same way, you can look to the future and have a really kind of lively, concrete sense of your future. My great-grandchildren are going to live in this house too. Therefore, I'm going to do what is necessary to make sure that they too can have an honorable life. And you can think about that extended, the way that this causes people to make sacrifices. You think of the great cathedrals of the Middle Ages. Most of the people who start building those cathedrals don't even live to see the completion because it takes so long. Right? And you might ask, well, why did people do that? Why did people work so hard on something that they would never even see the completion of? And, a big part of the reason why is because in feudal, aristocratic, medieval society, people had a really lively sense of the past and the future because they didn't imagine the past or the future being that different from the present. So they could think in terms of, I'm doing this for my great-grandchildren. I'm doing this for the honor of my great-grandfather. Whereas in a democratic society, oftentimes, and I've asked classes this in the past, oftentimes people don't even know the names of their great grandparents, much less where they lived or what they did for a living, right? So in a democracy, that strong sense of the past and of the future is not really there, in large part because, there's so much change in a democratic society, right? That we don't always have a lively sense of the past or a lively sense of the future. We think, well, who knows? Things change so much. So it makes you less attached to the past and the future, and thus much less willing to do things on behalf of the past or the future, as opposed to the present. Right? In a democratic society, people are much more focused on the short term and the medium term. Whereas in aristocratic societies, because of their stability, people oftentimes thought more in terms of the long term. Now, as he goes on to say, aristocratic institutions have, in addition, the effect of tightly connecting each man to several of his fellow citizens, right? Because everybody has those customary rights and obligations to everybody else. Since the classes within an aristocratic people are very distinct and immobile, each of them becomes for its members a sort of small fatherland, more visible and more precious than the larger one, right? So you have a real kind of lively sense of the place within society that you live. Since in aristocratic societies, all citizens are placed in a fixed post, right, where you were born at birth, some above the others, it again results that each of them always sees above him a man whose protection he needs, and below he sees another whose aid he may invoke. Right. So because of that hierarchy, these are the people that are above me that I can look to for certain things. These are the people below me that I also will owe things to. Right. So the men who live in aristocratic times are therefore almost always connected in a close way to something that is placed outside of themselves, and they are often disposed to forget themselves. It is true that in these same times, the general notion of one's fellow man is obscure, and that one scarcely thinks of sacrificing oneself for the cause of humanity, but one often sacrifices oneself for certain men. So there was a kind of lively sense of, sort of the human race of us all being kind of equal and the same. That's not there. But people have strong attachments to particular institutions and to particular people, and they live in accordance with that. So that's what an aristocratic society is like. It's people are sort of habituated to think in the long term in terms of the past and the future. They have a strong understanding of the people above them that can call on them, the people below them that can call on them, of their duties to one another. And so you have a tightly knit society where, as he says, people are almost always drawn outside of themselves, right? They can't just focus on their private concerns and their private interests. Whereas it is totally the other way around in a democratic society. As he goes on to say on page 205, the next paragraph, this is right near the bottom. In democratic times, on the contrary, when the duties of each individual toward the species are much clearer, right? You know what your general obligations are in terms of following the law. Devotion to one man becomes rarer. The tie of human affections is stretched and loosened. Among democratic peoples, new families are constantly emerging from nowhere. Other ones fall back into obscurity all the time. And all those that remain change their aspect, their appearance. The thread of the past is broken at every moment, and the vestige of prior generations is effaced. You easily forget those who have preceded you, and you have no idea of those who will follow you. One takes an interest only in those who are closest to you. Right? So, in other words, because of all of the social mobility that democratic equality and opportunity makes possible. You have families that are on the rise, you have families that are on the way down, you have people moving around all over the place. So society is marked so much by change that really you focus mostly on the present and on what's closest to you, because both the past and the future are hard to kind of get a sense of, or really to get a handle of. And that's why he says the thread of the past is broken. You don't really know what's going to come in the future. He says, and since each class comes to be similar to the others and is mingled with them, its members become indifferent and like strangers to each other. Aristocracy had made of all its citizens a long chain that went up from the peasant to the king, right? Everybody had a station and knew their duties. Democracy breaks the chain and separates each link from the others, right? Because there is no hierarchy, legally speaking, in a democracy. What this means concretely is that even though everybody has the same obligation to obey the law towards everybody else, beyond that, we don't have any particular obligations towards particular other people. Unlike, say, an aristocracy where you had particular obligations to your neighbors, particular obligations to the aristocrat that was in charge of the area, right? So you had particular duties. Whereas everybody has general duties in a democracy, but really that's about it, right? No fixed and immovable ties or obligations to other people. Social relations are much more voluntary, right? You can get a job, you can quit that job and seek another one. You can live in one place but decide to move somewhere else, right? You can have one set of friends and decide to get a different set of friends or whatever, right? Your life is much more based on your own decisions in a democracy. So as he goes on to say on page 206, As conditions become more equal, there are a larger number of individuals who, while no longer being rich enough or powerful enough to exercise a large influence on the fate of their fellow men, like the way the aristocrats used to be able to, have nonetheless acquired or conserved enough enlightenment and property to be able to be self-sufficient. Right? They can support themselves. These men owe nothing to anyone. They expect almost nothing from anyone. They are accustomed to always consider themselves in isolation, and they readily imagine that their whole destiny is in their hands. Right? So this is another feature of democracy, which is that there are a lot of people who, by and large, can view themselves as self-sufficient in the notion that, well, I work for a living, I support myself, I support my family, I take care of myself, right? I'm not asking for handouts from other people. So I'm not asking for things for other people. They shouldn't ask things from me. Let's just all kind of rely on ourselves. They have that kind of what he sees as really a sort of illusion of self-sufficiency in a democracy, right? I look to my own interests. I look to my own ideas and my own decisions. I'm in charge of my life. I support myself. I'll do my thing. You do yours. And so as he concludes, he says, in this way, democracy not only makes each man forget his forefathers, but it conceals his descendants from him and separates him from his contemporaries. It leads him back constantly towards himself alone and threatens finally to confine him entirely within the solitude of his own heart. Right? So because of the obscurity of the past and the obscurity of the future due to constant social change and mobility, right, and because of the sort of pursuit of self-sufficiency in the present and the pursuing of various opportunities, you sort of thrown back more and more on yourself and on those closest to you. And that's something that can only happen in a society marked by a relatively high amount of equality and opportunity and mobility. And so that's why anytime you have a democratic society, there's going to be a tendency towards individualism, towards kind of the narrowing of the focus to being on yourself and those nearest to you, as opposed to the past, the future, or the broader society in the present. So in the next lecture, I'll talk about what Tocqueville thinks are the ways that the Americans have combated individualism, namely through free institutions and civil associations.